The New York Football Giants had one of the best off seasons this year, adding key players like Blake Martinez from the Packers, Kyle Flacco from the Packers, James Bradbury from the Panthers, and drafting hopefully their new star tackle in Andrew Thomas from Georgia. They are almost a completely new team. Not really though, this team still has some pretty massive flaws that they need to work on. Talking about some of the bigger free agency losses they had, Eli Manning ended up retiring, and even though he didn't play much of 2019, he was still a pretty competent backup and almost won a game that he actually came in for when Danny Dimes was hurt. That officially ends the Eli Manning era with the New York Giants and starts the beginning of a new era with Daniel Jones, aka Danny Dimes. I will now be referring to him as Danny Dimes for the rest of this episode. One key thing about this offseason is the Giants didn't really have many notable superstar players like the Dallas Cowboys had, or even the Philadelphia Eagles. They only really lost some guys who almost underperformed. Alex Ogletree was not really a good pick for them after they traded for him to the LA Rams, and Mike Remmers was serviceable, but he wasn't an elite player by any means when he signed with the Denver Broncos for 1 year, a $2.5 million deal. Antoine Bethea is around 57 years old now, and he will leave a slight hole back there in the defense's secondary, as he did start all 16 games in 2019. But I think they did a pretty good job in the draft finding a hopeful good replacement for him. Some of the better moves they made this offseason were re-signing Leonard Williams to a franchise tag, at least $16.1 million for this 1 year, in a rare New York trade where they got him from the New York Jets. He hasn't been consistent, but he has some pretty good upside, and I think he definitely improves that defensive line for the New York Giants. They've signed Blake Martinez from the Packers to help fix that linebacking position that hasn't really had a star linebacker in years. They signed him for a 3-year, $30 million deal. Blake Martinez has had 140 tackles in the last 3 years, and he can bring some hopeful consistency to a position that has really underperformed in the New York Giants linebacking core. He does have some problems in pass coverage, and that is definitely worth noting. They also brought in Kyle Flacco from the Green Bay Packers as well. He's another serviceable linebacker who will be an instant improvement for whatever they had starting there. Looking at their quarterback room, after losing Eli Manning, I think they made a pretty good replacement in signing Colt McCoy to a pretty cheap deal, only $1.5 million guaranteed. He's a good backup who can come in and win some games, and he also has a pretty good rep in the league for being a pretty good teacher. I will be hopeful that he will help Daniel Jones and help him improve as a quarterback. I like this quarterback room. They also signed Cooper Rush from the Dallas Cowboys. He had some upside in some preseason games, and some people thought he might actually be a Dak Prescott replacement if a deal didn't work out for them there. I don't think Cooper Rush is a Dak Prescott replacement, but I think he's a good developmental quarterback who you might eventually be able to flip for some picks later on. Looking at running back, I am really disappointed that they didn't make a move, at least in the draft, to draft a backup here. Saquon Barkley is an elite superstar and the best running back in this division by a mile, but Dion Lewis does not really give you a solid backup behind him. Dion Lewis is a good pass catcher, but he isn't really anything much, and he's nearing 30 years old now. He hasn't really improved much, and he's declined from his Patriot days. Wayne Gallman is not someone you want to have starting if, God forbid, something does happen to Saquon Barkley. You don't want Wayne Gallman starting, and Jonathan Hillman is just playing out bad. This lack of depth at running back is a big issue after Saquon Barkley missed a couple games with a high ankle sprain. That depth could come in question again if something does happen to him. Probably one of the worst moves I saw them make was not signing a backup here to help replace Saquon Barkley. Now looking at wide receiver, they have a ton of wide receiver twos here. Golden Tate has really declined, but he's still a good rack guy. He's not a true wide receiver one, and he's more of a pretty good solid slot wide receiver. But Golden Tate can be a slight reliable guy if you need one. Sterling Shepard only played 10 games last year, and he's more of a solid wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3. Darius Lane came out of nowhere in his rookie year, and he has some pretty high upside. He might be a low-end wide receiver 1 for this team, and I really like him. But as of now, he plays more like a wide receiver 2, and you're really stuck with a ton of wide receiver 2s. If you're looking at the wide receiver depth here, Corey Coleman has done jack his entire career, and he's been a huge bust after being drafted pretty high in the NFL draft. And Cody Core is really just bad. I don't know why they re-signed him. Hopefully they see something in him, but honestly, I don't. And really, when you look at the verdict for this wide receiver room, it's a ton of wide receiver 2s, with Slayton having some decent wide receiver 1 upside. Honestly, you need to draft a wide receiver here, and look for them to draft a wide receiver pretty early in the 2021 NFL draft. The depth here is also pretty bad. If something does happen injury-wise, you could be in a huge hole. And honestly, that is not a position you want to put your young quarterback in Danny Dimes. Looking at tight end, Evan Engram is the face of potential, but he has been getting consistently hurt in the last 2 years. And after a pretty hopeful rookie campaign, those injuries have really stifled his production. And honestly, 2019 was his worst year as a professional to date, seeing his yardage drop and his catch rate drop as well from 2018. His fifth-year option was just picked up by GM Dave Gettleman. It is worrying that he has declined, but hopefully they can put him something back together, and hopefully if he can stay healthy, that he can be a nice, reliable target for Danny Dimes. They also signed Lavine Toilolo in free agency. He's more of a backup guy, and he's sort of just meh, nothing really spectacular here. But I don't think if Evan Engram goes down, you're going to have a huge hole, especially with Caden Smith being there and he being a pretty serviceable guy here. The depth here is pretty decent, and honestly, my verdict for this position is Evan Engram needs to improve, and if he improves, you can have a pretty big jump here. Looking at offensive line, Nate Solder has just been a massive hole for that team, and he has a $19.5 million cap hit this year. Pretty big hole for them, and as a whole, he's really underperformed for that huge contract he got back in 2018. Will Hernandez also declined after being drafted in the second round in 2018. He had a pretty fantastic rookie campaign, but his sophomore year he declined. He went from the number 7th left guard ranked in PFF and number 14 total to dropping to 28 according to Pro Football Focus. You want to see him increase and hopefully improve. Hopefully Joe Judge will implement a new system that will fit to his strengths more. That was not something that really happened for him in his sophomore campaign. Spencer Pulley is just not good. He's started some games, but he's a massive hole at center. And Kevin Zeidler has been one of the more consistent guards in this league. He's locked-in starter for them, and potentially maybe the only locked-in starter other than their first-round draft pick in Andrew Thomas. Georgia has had a pretty good history of pumping out really good offensive linemen in recent years, and I think Andrew Thomas could be an instant improvement for that offensive line. Overall, though, they don't have much depth. They signed Cameron Fleming, and he's a pretty solid depth player, but other than that, the depth on this team is a massive hole. Overall, this offensive line is one of the worst in totality when you look at the NFC East. Massive holes at left tackle and center, and they're far too dependent on Will Hernandez to make a third-year leap. And Kevin Zeidler, while being the best offensive lineman on this line by far, he is really the only serviceable player. Andrew Thomas is a rookie, and granted, I have high hopes for him, but you're too dependent on two young players to fix that offensive line as a whole, and the lack of depth is again very concerning. You're sensing a trend here. The depth on this roster as a whole is almost non-existent, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Pivoting to the defensive line, Leonard Williams has been one of the better players for that team. They drafted Dexter Lawrence from Clemson last year, and he had a pretty good rookie year, and I think you can expect good things from him. Dalvin Tomlinson has been one of the more underrated nose tackles in the league, and Lorenzo Carter is more of a 3-4 outside linebacker. He's been a pretty average pass rusher for them and an average linebacker as a whole. BJ Hill is a pretty good depth player as well, and they signed Austin Johnson in free agency for some more depth. Honestly, Dexter Lawrence and Dalvin Tomlinson and Leonard Williams highlight this group. I really like the defensive line as a whole. I don't think it's a massive hole in this team as overall as well. The depth here is not as concerning as the rest of the roster, so I think they improved on the defensive line front as well. Pivoting to linebacker, which has been one of the bigger holes in recent years, bringing in Blake Martinez and Kyler Fackrell has really helped them, I think, and it will be a pretty big leap after having a pretty big hole in the linebacker position for the last 3 or 4 years. David Miles, another solid player here, but overall their linebacker position, while having improved, the depth is still very much bad. They drafted Tay Crowder, and according to Outlanders.com, this 7th rounder could potentially be second on the depth chart. Granted, that could be good drafting, but I see it more as not having good depth overall at that position. You don't want to have multiple 7th rounders potentially being the next man up on the defensive depth chart. Now, looking at the cornerback room and defensive back as a whole, I really like this group. I think it's one of the better groups in the NFC East as a whole, and maybe even the NFC. James Bradbury was a stud down there in Carolina. He followed number 1 wide receivers routinely, and he ended up facing the likes of Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Michael Thomas, and Julio Jones multiple times a year, and he held his own pretty well. One of the better moves that this team has made in the recent years was signing him to a long-term deal. DeAndre Baker is going to be a second-year player moving forward. He will hopefully improve. He showed some sparks in his rookie campaign, but he needs to improve, and I think he will. He does have all the talent to be a good corner. Corey Valentine was another good player, as well as Julian Love, and Darnay Holmes was drafted from UCLA in the 4th round. He has some pretty good potential as well. He has some good slot corner skills and measurables. He does lack some of that arm length that you'd want, and some coaches would completely write him off their board with his short arms, but he has that talent to play that slot corner position really well. Jabo Peppers also had his 5th-year option picked up, and he played admirably in his rookie year with the team, essentially, after being traded in the OBJ trade. And Xavier McKinney, he was probably the best draft pick in the entire NFL draft, getting him in the early 2nd round. He was a really good strong safety and had some pretty good picks and really firm tackler as well. I really liked him. He was my number 1 safety going into the draft, and getting him pretty late, seeing that he was drafted in the 2nd round when he could have been a 1st-round pick. I really like the potential of this group as a whole, and honestly, they've improved massively in my opinion. Looking at the kicker position, Aldo Rosas did have a pretty steep decline, moving from making 97% of his kicks in 2018 to only making 70.6 in 2019. That is pretty worrisome, but overall he's a pretty solid kicker, making almost 90% of his extra points as well. He needs to improve, and I think he will probably have a bounce back year. And Riley Dixon has been one of the better kickers in the league as well, finishing in the top 10 in most measurable stats. Overall, this New York Giants roster, they have improved heavily, and if Daniel Jones can take that 2nd-year leap that you see many quarterbacks make, like Carson Wentz and even Deshaun Watson being a pretty good player, not only in his rookie year, but in his 2nd year, if that can happen to Daniel Jones, this team could potentially go out there and maybe win 7 or 8 games and surprise the entire league. The lack of depth is, again, similar to the Cowboys, pretty worrisome, but I like what they have there in their cornerback and defensive line group as well. And I think overall, if they can sort of stay healthy, maybe if Saquon Barkley doesn't go down, they could be a really surprising team in 2020.